Hello there and welcome back to The Closet Historian and back to my sewing parlor for another project. And today I'm diving into something decidedly retro, a very classic vintage design. Because while I'll be mimicking this McCall's pattern image quite closely today with my dress, I'll be making View C, which is pictured in this tiny little drawing instead. These same sort of pattern modifications can be used to make many retro styles, things from the 1930s, 40s, and even into the 50s, and of course, depending on how you dial in the details of this same sort of modification can work for all of those styles. And because making the patterns for these designs does require a little bit of contouring, something I have been touching on, if not ragging on, recently, I thought it would be a good design to go ahead and demonstrate for all of you. But seeing as I'll be sewing with a slippery rayon crepe today and have a lot of seam binding ahead of me, I had better go ahead and dive on in. And I begin with my basic bodice block front, of course, as usual. And here again is that design that I will be trying to mimic today. And though it's difficult to tear our eyes away from how cute these little hats are, you can see that they offered this pattern in 1939 with 3 different sleeve lengths, the long sleeve, the 3/4, and then the short sleeve View C that I will be replicating today. But the first thing I am going to do here with my pattern is temporarily send all of my dart fullness on vacation up here into the neckline. So I'm going to find a spot about midway through the neckline and draw in a dart line from that mid-neck point to the apex. I'm going to close both the waist and the side dart up into this neckline dart for now. I just want everything from below the bust on my pattern to be completely smooth so that I can feel free to draw in my empire waistline yoke down here any shape I would like without the dart degree chilling in there to distract me. This is not my final dart manipulation, but it is still useful while constructing the rest of this design. Just layering that waist dart closed like so, pivoting everything from the apex. Of course, the apex is the top of the cone here on the front of the bust if we're looking at this geometrically. Do remember to watch the Darts Drafting Dangerous video if you'd like to understand exactly what is happening with the cone on the front of the bodice. But I will tape both of these shut and cut away some of the excess since I know I won't be needing it. I will be moving the dart fullness from where I just put it in the neckline, but I won't be moving it back down here to the waist. Alright, so all 52 degrees of my dart fullness are now sitting up here in the neckline. We will use some of that later in other places, but for now I just needed this smooth midriff to work with, and I can now draw in my waist yoke. However, I want to keep in mind where the bust is sitting in here, because while the apex may be the epicenter of the cone on the front of the bodice, I still have the rest of the cup fullness to contend with. And if you were to look in the Armstrong text, Pattern Making for Fashion Design, that text recommends a 3-inch radius around the apex to avoid interacting with the direct volume of the bust. Now, of course, as an average, 3 inches is not going to work for everyone. I would say the larger the cup size, the more you're going to want to add on to that. 3.5, 4, 5, 6, depends on the size of your pattern and the size of the bust in question. I'll be using the 3-inch radius today, but honestly, I think for my body, I do need to bump up to maybe 3.5, and I do wear a 36 double D, for those of you who would like a general reference point on when to start shifting from that 3-inch average. And now, where I know to avoid drawing in this line, I can make sure that it is below the bust. Of course, if you wanted to have your midriff come up across the bust, you can. Though if you have this sort of style line directly interfering across the bust fullness itself, I would recommend not contouring this lower waist piece in the same way I'm about to, because you are going to be interacting with more volume than I'm expecting. Because I'm below the shelf of the bust, I can go ahead and contour this closer to the body, but if you're not below that shelf of the bust, you still have to contend with it, of course. And I've peaked this up along the center front to about between the apex. It's a little below between the apex, probably a 1/2 inch down. So this is a pretty low neckline, and I will have to make concessions because of that later on, so we'll talk about that when we get to it. But right now I can go ahead and contour this lower midriff yoke. If you remember back to the curved darts video, I know from making that mock-up that I can pinch away an additional 1/2 inch of fullness below my bust along this waist dart. So if I want this midriff piece for this project to sit completely flush against my body, I can go ahead and remove an additional 1/2 inch right here below the bust. This is a similar amount of contouring as you will find recommended in textbooks, but of course it is best to find out what your actual numbers are as opposed to just relying on averages, because everybody is different. And there are recommended contouring exercises that you can then mark on your block patterns to know for future reference if you want to do a lot of stuff like this in the future, and I can go ahead and link you to those particular pages from the Armstrong text in the description below. But I'm just going to go ahead and cut the waist dart back open and overlap this an additional 1/2 inch, tape it back closed, and then recorrect the seam allowance. Tape down my floops. Now, of course, if I were to try and sew this back together immediately, this is now a tiny bit shorter, so this would no longer match. Luckily, I'm about to do a lot more on this top piece, so I don't have to worry about that, but if you were going to go straight in and sew these back together, you have to understand that there is that discrepancy going on. But up here, I'm going to close up my temporary neckline dart, like so, But once again, I know I am running up into an area I should contour because I'm about to lower this neckline significantly. So instead of taping this right back together, I do need to overlap this 3/8 of an inch at least up here. And again, choosing that measurement was influenced both by the standards listed in the textbook and also just having worked with my own body before. And when I close up a little bit of extra fullness here, I'm adding it into the dart that we are left with. So my dart fullness is going from the original 52 degrees and increasing. Because we have cut into the main bodice, into the hollow volumes that the standard basic block leaves, I can actually cut those volumes closer to the body, cut those away, and achieve an even closer fit, which is very essential when lowering the neckline this much. Now, because I'm about to lower this neckline so significantly to right between the apexes, I do need to pinch out an additional amount of contouring to contour the area between the apexes as well. So I'm going to pinch out another 1/2 inch down here. So that first overlap we just took out higher up and along the neckline, make sure the neckline edge lays close against the collarbone, and down here I want to make sure that the neckline edge sits closer to the skin of my chest between the bust. And a quick little aside here just to say that I'm thinking to myself, maybe I should cut this with the straight edge neckline along the straight grain and it would stretch less, which is not what I ended up doing in the end, but I do think I would probably prefer it, especially when working with a floopier fabric that I failed to interface, but we'll cover that later. But the degree down here is different. It's no longer 52 degrees that I began with. I can actually go ahead and measure that and we'll find out what's going on. Instead of 52 degrees, I now have 63 degrees. So I have an 11-degree difference, over 10-degree difference between my dart fullness on my standard block and this new midriff contoured pattern. And that's not to say that if I had left the dart degree as the same, it wouldn't fit. It would still sort of fit. Things just might gape because we're interacting with the hollow areas that the standard block leaves. But because that is a ton of dart fullness, I will go ahead and split that down here below the bust. So I've just opened up another line to kind of distribute this, and I will fill that in. Again, I still have to add seam allowance down here because I have added it to the midriff piece and it will need it down here as well. But to me, it looks like this design from 1939 has more gathering than just the bust fit would allow for. So whether you are dealing with 63 degrees of dart fullness or 23, this next step where I add in additional fullness for style reasons, just for fashion reasons as opposed to fit, is important to consider anytime you want to add more gathering in an area. So I'm going to draw a line up into the shoulder from this zone where I want more gathering, about 1.5 inches out from either side of the apex. You want to draw your line from where you want the gathering to where you want the gathering lines to kind of pull from, and so I want these to kind of extend up into the shoulder. Also, if you wanted to have gathering below the bust and up at the shoulder, all you would have to do here is instead of adding in wedges of fullness, add in channels of fullness so that you have extra fullness both at that umpire line and up at the shoulder that you would gather down to fit. More like these other designs, also from the late 30s, early 1940s, I would guess. You could also just add in more gathering up at the shoulder and leave the fit gathering alone down here. But honestly, if I were to add in a bunch of shoulder gathering, I would probably just use this dart fullness up there as well and have a smooth stitch line instead down here underneath the bust. So in general, we are left with all of our dart fullness on this upper portion of the bodice, and you can shift it anywhere. You can put it up into the neckline, into the side seam, up into the shoulder, down here at the bust. You are still free to design with this dart fullness any which way you desire. And I will go ahead and add in a good 1.5 inches into each of these new wedges of fullness that will create the additional gathering I am looking for. Honestly, with my fabric, it was thin enough I could probably have gotten away with adding 2 inches or more into this area, but this still worked, and that's just something to know for next time. And once again, I will smooth off this excess here. I may lose a tiny bit smoothing this off cleanly, but because we've just added an extra fullness, I am not at all worried about that. So all of this will gather back down and fit into our waist yoke, like so. And at long last, I can go ahead and add in my 1/2 inch of seam allowance. Now, because I have a straight neckline here, this V is plunging all the way to between the busts, honestly, I can go ahead and add a grown on facing. That is why when I drew this neckline in, I actually came out a 1/2 inch along the shoulder seam because I want to cut the seam allowance up there away when I was drawing in this neckline. This neckline has no seam allowance on it yet, would not technically match up with the back anymore. But that is because instead of sewing on a facing to the front of this, I am going to have a grown on facing. Something that is only really possible when you have a straight line like this. So what I've done is I've taped on another 2.5 inches of paper, folded that underneath to get the correct angle, and instead of sewing on a facing, I can just have this be a folded clean edge. And the reason I went with this grown on facing was because it seemed to be what was indicated of this particular vintage design. But something else I've noticed here far too late is that they almost do seem to be indicating that this waist piece and the upper waist front here might be cut both on the straight grain, and maybe that's something I should have done for mine to help avoid any more stretching of this neckline, because of course, while we can do all we can to help things from gaping here in the pattern drafting, and the fabric will still have a mind of its own. Now for the back of this dress, it doesn't seem that they had done anything particularly special with the actual vintage version, but I'm going to go ahead and do the same sort of modifications that I just did to the front. So I'm going to create a midriff waist yoke here across the back that will match up along the side with the one I did for the front. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the front piece and mark where I need to match that along the side seam here. So I'm just going to keep this slightly chevroned. And once again, I have thrown all of the waist fullness up into the shoulder for now while I work on this. Just cutting along the center line. I don't have an apex back here, but I do have a sort of raised, curved zone. So things may not shift from an exacting epicenter like they do on the front, but I can still use the dart points in the back in a similar way to pivot my dart fullness around. And because I'm not dealing with the same sort of volume of hollow space that the bust may create on the front, I don't actually have to contour this piece here in the back to get it to lay close to my skin. Or my slip, in my case, if I'm being a proper lady. However, I will still need to have seam allowance, so I'll go ahead and add that in. And I do have an inch of seam allowance along my center back because I will be setting in a zipper, a center back zipper, because it's me. And I always use a center back zipper. That's correct. Now I will go ahead and open that waist dart back up again because I will leave this in here as gathering. And in fact, I will close my shoulder dart and add that in as gathering along this edge as well. This is just going to create a little bit of a blousier effect to the dress in general. Of course, you don't have to add this in, but I do think it lends to the late 30s, 1940s vibe of this whole project. So once again, I will cut down to the pivot point of the shoulder dart and then cut up through the waist dart and just shift that shoulder dart fullness down here along the waist yoke where it's going to be gathered in. I now have plenty there to gather for the back. I don't need to add like excess gathering to the back, although you certainly could, using that same sort of technique that we used on the front to add additional wedges of fullness. But once again, I will smooth off the excess and add seam allowance along this style line here on the back. Like so. This will of course gather back down into this waist yoke, and now we have something for the back that mimics the front in style as opposed to just having a simple plain basic block back, which would have been perfectly valid and does seem to be what the vintage pattern image had gone for. Now for the neckline up here, because I do have that grown on facing on the front, I will need to match that up with an actual facing here on the back. Because this neckline is curved, I cannot do a grown on facing back here. So I'll just trace a 2.5 inch wide neckline facing for my back neckline here. And I will interface this, which was a smart decision, honestly. Sometimes I just feel bad putting like a modern fusible interfacing on a nice rayon crepe, but I shouldn't. If they had access to modern fusible, like Pellon interfacing in 1939, I'm sure they would have liked to use it. But that is my bodice pattern all finished up. I can go ahead and set that aside and start working on a slight puff sleeve to set into this. I'm sure I have a short puff sleeve somewhere in my bag o' sleeves that I keep here in the studio, but I didn't want to have to dig through it today. I honestly need to organize my studio, but that's a future video and a future problem. I've just traced the top half of my basic block sleeve here, though clearly I had trouble straightening off my bicep line for some reason. I'm going to go ahead and make this about 4 inches long to start, though I will shorten this later. So clearly I was just thinking out loud here. Couldn't exactly decide what I wanted, but I want to add some puff to the top sleeve cap of this, so I'm going to draw some angled lines 2 inches out along the sleeve cap towards the center, like so. And I have an episode of Drafting Dangerous all about modifying the sleeve and adding puff to the sleeve, either puff here at the sleeve cap or puff at the cuff, so I can link you over to that as well if you'd like to understand better what exactly I have going on here. But I'm basically adding in a crescent of fullness here above the bicep line, which tilts my sleeve cap up and out, adding fullness into the top of the sleeve cap area and along the arm side line of the sleeve cap up here. I'm going to raise this a little bit further as well, because you don't just want to add gathering, you also need to add height if you want puff. You don't want gathering, you want puff, and they are a little bit different. I probably could have added more. Honestly, this is a very subtle puff sleeve. I could have gone harder. I do tend to err on the side of under-gathering things in general, whether it be gathered sections on designs or puff sleeves. But I guess when I'm not making mock-ups, which I so rarely am, I'd rather end up with a little bit less gathering and puff in my final dress than too much. But I will go ahead and tape down my floops, and now I have a subtle puff sleeve to work with. Although I held this up to my arm and I thought, you know, that's almost to my elbow. I should probably shorten this. So then I took off a good inch here at the hem. I took off probably 1.25 inches here, it looks like. Whatever it was, again, I'm not measuring. I rarely actually measure anything while working, as we can see. And I'll just use this little piece I've cut off to straighten off the sides at this point, because really, that's right. Now this original 1939 design does show an A-line skirt, so I'll go ahead and grab my A-line skirt pattern. And I actually found a tracing of my A-line that had seam allowance down the center front, so I could have this center front seam just like the vintage design. However, they are suggesting in their cut layout that you cut this center seam along the bias, and I just didn't have enough fabric to actually do that for my project today. It would be quite fun, especially when using a striped fabric like on this pattern envelope, but I just couldn't make it work for my particular project. So in the end, I did cut my skirt with the center line of the front along the fold, so I did not have a center front seam, just because I have a wide width fabric and I can get away with it. And when you know you're going to have to somehow finish all of your raw edges in a slippery rayon, one less seam means less time fighting with rayon seam biting. So at this point, I'll take it where I can get it. And my skirt was 29 inches long today. I do prefer a longer skirt, as we know. Though especially during wartime, it was much more standard to have your hem end almost right at the knee. But I'm going to very carefully try and cut this pattern out of this very floopy, watery, floral print rayon crepe from moodfabrics.com. This feels very much like just a slightly paperier version of silk crepe de chine, though of course this is, as I said, rayon, which is of course a perfectly accurate fabric to use for an early 1940s dress. Though it would be far more cutting edge at that time. And if this fabric is still available over on Mood, I will go ahead and link it below for you. It does feel like a sort of dark mode version of a Liberty print, and it's just moody enough to not exactly feel cheerful anymore, which is exactly what I'm after. I won't even plant daisies or echinacea like out in my yard because I find them too cheerful. I need macabre, morose, you know? Somber. I don't want cheerful. Anyhow, speaking of rayon seam binding, here I have gotten out the Hug Snug, and I've cut some little strips here. I should have honestly cut a long strip and folded it and like pressed it into place into my taco strip like this while it was all in one length and then cut them down. But, you know, it took me doing this once to discover that because it's been a while since I pulled out the rayon seam binding. And finishing 80% of my raw edges with this rayon seam binding is going to be annoying and was actually the most time-consuming part of this entire project. You could probably run a rayon crepe through the serger. I'm sure I have done it before, but for some reason I felt like, I don't know, doing my due diligence this time and putting the rayon seam binding on. I guess because I haven't made a floopy dress in a while, I felt that I had saved up patience to do it, but by the end, of course, I was completely running dry. And I will go ahead and use some lightweight fusible interfacing to interface my back-facing pieces here, and I will finish this curved edge again with the rayon seam binding. This is called Hug Snug. It is no longer in production, but you can still pick up rolls of it over on Etsy or eBay, and I highly recommend you do that now, because I'm not sure anyone out there is making anything quite this loosey-goosey and soft. You can use this Hug Snug on a curve no problem, even though it is not actually a bias weave, weirdly enough. I should honestly pick up another roll of black myself to have on hand so that, you know, I have a lifetime supply. But I just pinch this and fold it in half along the length of the ribbon, I suppose, press that into place, and then sandwich my raw edges in between it, pin this into place, and stitch it secure over on the machine. Though unfortunately I did experience additional delays during this seam binding process because some of my pieces were inaccessible, were sort of stuck in customs under further review, as it were. I wear my self-facing along the front here, would be raw inside. I did of course want to use rayon seam binding on that edge as well, which does help it from stretching a tiny bit, but not enough. I probably should have interfaced this. I was afraid because the texture of the fabric once it was interfaced was so different than it was on its floopy, watery own that it would create more problems than it solved, but I think I underestimated the situation. All's well that ends well enough, though. Just be careful not to stretch this while you're doing it. And of course, as soon as I finally had access to the other pieces I needed to bind, there was someone sitting in my chair at the machine. She had to share. Honestly, I decided to just sit carefully on the very edge of the chair, and she stayed right there while I was doing this. So it's lucky Sophia is very adorable. She came back and did this again later when I was hemming this dress. I don't think I got footage of it that time, though. I do love wearing a rayon crepe fabric, by the way, or a crepe fabric in general. Preferably silk, but it's even more expensive than rayon. But I don't like sewing with it. Sometimes people ask me if I'll do a video on like how to deal with difficult fabrics, and the answer is I don't like doing it. So like you never see me sew with chiffon. It's not because I don't like chiffon. Chiffon seems nice, but doesn't seem nice to work with. So I don't like to torture myself too much in the sewing room. I will sew on beads and sequins for days until my back and like entire body ache, but I just don't want to have to try and either cut out chiffon or like charmeuse or try and sew with it. My patience only leans in certain directions. So even a rayon crepe, although far crispier than say a chiffon, is still on the annoying side to me, and I only have so much bandwidth for working with these things. I usually only make 1 or 2 rayon crepe projects a year because as much as I love wearing it, I just don't love stitching with it. Now I did cut out extra waist yoke pieces so that I could line just that area of this garment today, but I will set that lining in last as opposed to doing the sandwich method for this sort of a midriff style project. That is a perfectly acceptable way to construct things, but I think it less versatile when it comes to maybe coming back in here and altering this ever in the future. So I actually prefer to line that section at the end, and you will see that later in this video. But because I'm going to be lining the waist, you'll notice that I did not finish these edges with rayon seam binding, especially because that would be rather bulky in all the areas where I'm going to be adding in plenty of gathering anyhow. And that is my next step. I need to mark and put in my gathering stitch lines everywhere it needs to be across the back and front. And I just try and extend my gathering stitching a couple inches out from the area where I've added in the fullness, because naturally I can dial in exactly where I want that gathering to fall once I'm playing with the gathering in a moment and pinning the pieces together. And speaking of rayon crepe, if you're watching closely, you will notice I'm often patting the fabric or like gently running my fingers along it and kind of, massaging it. And that is because I'm trying to not stretch things and maintain a proper grain line as I work as much as possible. And once I have my gathering stitching done along the bottom edge of this back piece, I will go ahead and add on the neckline facings for these back pieces. Seems like an early point in the process to be doing that, but I cannot actually sew the shoulder seams to the fronts until these are faced, because the front has the facing included, therefore the back will need to have the facing included as well before I can sew the shoulder seam. Hopefully that makes any sense. I'm always kind of working backwards when it comes to figuring out what my order of operations needs to be. I'm always thinking, oh, I need to sew the shoulder seams, but what do I need to do before that? It's hard to explain, but I do think you just pick it up with time. So here I have my front peaked yoke piece here. Just give that a quick press, and again, pat it around, trying to make sure things are not stretching out of place. Add in stay stitching or interfacing if you want it to really not stretch. What a wild idea. So I'm going to take the first front piece here, and I'm going to pin this in place along the peak of the neckline. I'm going to tie off one side of my gathering stitching. That way I can have one point of stability here, so I can gather this down to fit along this line. Again, I'm trying very hard to make sure I'm not stretching anything out of whack. This is the hard part of this project when it comes to a floopier fabric. This is not the loosest weave ever, so it's still like a pretty closely woven fabric, but it is a crepe, so there is an inherent stretchiness, a mechanical stretch in a crepe fabric, because the reason that crepe fabrics are crepey is because the threads or the yarns have been over twisted so that they kind of twist back up on themselves, which adds, again, a mechanical stretch to the fabric. There's no spandex in this. It's not a knit fabric. The structure allows for stretch, but not because it's knitted or crocheted. Ooh, hopefully this makes any sense. Did any of the rest of you have to take a couple semesters of textiles back in college? Just me? Yeah. I do have a couple of textile videos here on the channel if you'd like to learn more about wovens versus knits, etc. I don't go into extreme detail, but as a good baseline for beginners if you're new to fabrics in general, I do hope they would be a worthwhile watch. I am keeping this concentrated right under the bust and not near the side seam though, just because that's how it seemed the vintage design was done. And once I have this pinned into place, I can flip the self-facing over so that it is caught within this seam and held into place. And you'll notice I am stitching this bodice on one side at a time. And over here on the machine, you can see I still haven't sewn those facings on, so I'll do that real fast, and then I will stitch on this first side of the front. Trying to remember to remove my pins as I go. I'm still using my standard 12 stitches per inch over here on the Singer 99K with Gutermann all-purpose thread in black today, and I do have a size 10 Microtex finer needle for working with this floopier fabric today. And here's what the first side of this looks like. I'll give everything a quick press. I'm going to try and remember, as I do this, to press all of my seam allowance into that middle section, which will, of course, again, eventually be lined. So all of this raw edge nonsense gathering will be contained in that lining in the end. I'm just going to fold the first side out of the way as much as I can so I can work on this second side here. And I'm going to do the same thing all over again. Gather this down to fit into place. and again distribute those gathers as much as I can right where I want them. And I just have to take care to make sure that I'm not catching the other side when I stitch right up to this central point here between the bust. This is actually a much more seasonally appropriate project for me, something I'm not always good at doing. I do try and have my schedule for like what I want to make line up with the actual weather going on outside so that I can wear these things when I'm finished them instead of having to wait a few months, but it doesn't always work out for me. Sometimes I end up making like a wool suit in the summertime and a like strappy dress in the winter, because by the time my schedule gets moved around and delayed so much because things take longer than I think they will, it's almost nice that past me always thinks future me is going to be so proficient, but honestly I'm way too human for that. So I'm constantly and inevitably always a few days behind schedule, which is, yes, silly, because who makes the schedule? I do. So am I a good boss to myself? No. But I am trying to get better about just making myself guilty for essentially no reason. I'm trying to get better at that over the years. It has been and continues to be a slow journey, though, sadly enough. Hence why this video is not coming out on a Thursday. But, you know, within 48 hours, that will no longer matter. So why am I so upset about it? I don't know. Something for a therapist one day to figure out with me. As if I'd ever make time to actually start seeing a therapist. That sounds like way too much admin to even begin with. Anyhow, the other side is sewn on, as I've begun rambling, and once again I will try and remember to press my seam allowance down into the waist. Thank you. There you go. And you can see the bodice starting to come together here. Now you could do some edge stitching or top stitching on this to keep this in place. I did not bother today because the crepe ironed so crisply and nice. And here on the back I will go ahead and clip the curves on this back facing, flip that down into place, and then despite how crispy this folded edge was holding, I did decide to go ahead and put understitching on up here. Once again, I have to, explain myself in hindsight, and sometimes I don't know why I did one thing or another at the time, Sometimes I have to remember that it's impressive I get anything done, when on the inside I feel like I'm a disaster most of the time. Oh my god, there's a really cuddly orange cat behind me. I'm gonna put in a clip. Hold on. Why are you so cute? Are you awake? You're half awake. Yeah, you're very distracting. I'm trying to work. What are you doing? Does this really count as being an assistant editor? I'm not sure it does, but I'm not sure it does. And once I have the back midriff pieces put on like this, as you can see I have the first one done here, I will go ahead and use that rayon seam binding along the center back as well, just because that will be left exposed on the inside after I put my zipper in. But I still have to sew the other side. Again, this is the same sort of process that I just used to sew on the fronts. However, there's just less to gather down here in the back, because I only had this little bit of gathering for fit as opposed to additional wedges of fullness set in here as well. Once again, kind of concentrate that gathering towards the center here, where I want it on the back, and then I will stitch this over on the machine, bring it back over to the ironing board, and press all of the extra seam allowance into the waist section. And again, I do have more rayon seam binding to add to the center back at this point, and I was only able to do it one side at a time. He looks almost grumpy here, but then he gives a slow blink. Anyhow, I guess I'll work on the sleeves for a bit because that piece seems inaccessible. I'll go ahead and press my underarm seams open on these sleeves and put my gathering stitching into the sleeve caps. And why don't I go ahead and just hem these, because clearly the other side of the back of the bodice is going to be occupied for a bit. So I'm just going to turn the hem of my sleeves up 1/4 inch twice, and then I will hand stitch this hem into place. And once I finally recovered the other back piece and was able to bind the back edge, I can sew my side seams here. So I'm going to sew the backs onto the front. And I can line up my shoulder seam as well because that facing on the back is already in place. I didn't add any extra space for shoulder pads for this dress, but of course with something from the late 30s into the 40s, you could add in at least a little bit of shoulder padding here. The early 40s was a very strong shouldered time. And honestly, there was a strong shoulder in the late 30s as well, although it was less shoulder padding, I would feel like, in the late 30s and more puff. I mean, there was always both, but, you know, how you achieve your strong shoulder. You've got multiple methods at your disposal. Just flap that facing towards the inside here once this shoulder seam is stitched, and I can go ahead and press open my side seam as well. Again, the assembly on this dress is quite simple and not at all time consuming. It all just comes down to how floopy of a fabric you choose, which of course in my case added on at least a day to this project, dealing with all these darn raw edges and keeping everything from stretching. And at this point I was starting to think about lining that little waist piece. So I have my extra front and back waist yokes here that I needed to seam together along the side seams as well. So I did that and then pressed in all these edges a 1/2 inch because I know I will need to have these nice and clean later on when I go to set this into the dress. And I will go ahead and set this aside for now and set in my sleeves. From what I hear, an oft dreaded part of the process, however, I never find it very difficult, possibly because I'm often using a puffed sleeve, and a puff at the top of this solves any fit issues. Of course, the sleeve fits down into the arm side because of how I have drafted the initial blocks together, but also because I have all this extra ease at the top of the cap. Who would ever know if I also needed to ease in a bit of extra? Nobody. Honestly, the hardest part of this is, again, not stretching either side, the arm side or the sleeve cap, as I try and match these up here in the floopy crepe. I like to pin the side seams to the underarm seam first, and then the shoulder seams together along the sleeve cap. That way I know I can fit each side down into place without like losing my orientation here in the arm side. And again, I will concentrate my gathering up near the top of the sleeve cap, probably about an inch, inch and a half out from the center itself. And I had not actually seamed my side seams of my A-line skirt together yet, so I'll go ahead and do that. As you can see, I have added rayon seam binding to those as well, along the length of my skirt. But I just need to seam these together so that I can attach the skirt to the bodice at the waistline. I will say, as usual, if you have any particular vintage styles or designs you would like to see me demonstrate here on the channel, to please leave those suggestions in the comments below for me. I am always on the hunt for different things I can demonstrate for you. There are a lot of things that I, of course, would not wear myself, but I know you want to know how to do. So it's good to push me and bother me about them, because then eventually I will try and get to them. And because the YouTube backend does not like a hyperlink in a comment, do try and find perhaps a vintage pattern number that is of a similar style that you're looking for, and just give me like McCall's 3333 or whatever, and then I will go ahead and find that over on the like vintage pattern wiki and be able to see what you are after. Should we all go look up McCall's 3333? I bet you they have one. I have no idea what it would be. Is there a rhyme or reason to the way that patterns are numbered? Interesting. Maybe on a company by company basis. It'd be interesting if like all designs for wovens started with a 3 and all designs for knits started with a 4, something like that. Is there a code? Let me know. I have no idea. Here I am just sewing the skirt onto the bodice at the waist, by the way. That's what's actually going on screen while I ramble on about vintage patterns. Something that I don't use, but I do kind of use, if you know what I mean. I only ever use the envelope, the front and back, but never the contents. Though I have noticed some, I don't think directly AI made, but definitely AI adjusted vintage pattern images floating around over on Pinterest now. It's finally starting to come from my Pinterest algorithm. Most of my algorithm is still pretty clean over there for some reason. I don't know how I've avoided a lot of generative stuff up to this point, but it is starting to infiltrate my research when I'm looking for vintage pattern images. I do notice some that are like, wow, this is a really clean and high color image. And then I'm like, has this been touched up with assistance? Which I will try, of course, to avoid ever referencing or including, because not my jam. And I'll definitely tell you what, an algorithm does not understand pattern designs for a human being body, so that's just never going to be a thing. Although I guess we can feel bad for AI that it will never get to wear clothes, I hope. I have pressed my seam allowance up into the waist bit again. I will actually not put the lining in yet, though. I will put in my zipper first. So I'm going to go ahead and match the center back up here. Match. Why did I just say match that way? Match up the center back. Apparently I'm from Wisconsin today. Don't know how. I will hold my zipper up to the center back here to see where I need to stitch from from the end of the zipper down to the hem in this A-line skirt, and I will stitch that closed first, again using 1-inch seam allowance, which is what I leave for myself along the center back. I don't really need that much seam allowance when putting in a lapped zipper, and if I ever put one in the side of a skirt, I only ever leave myself the 1/2 inch, so it's clearly not necessary, but it does allow for me to technically have a tiny bit of adjustability. I could take the zipper out, annoying, and add in a 1/2 inch to my dress if I ever wanted to let it out, but I am way too lazy to ever actually do that. I hate picking up a seam ripper, and you'll never see me adjusting clothes. I'd rather make a new dress from scratch than have to adjust one. We each have our quirks, don't we? All right? Idiosyncrasies, as it were. Anyway, I'm pressing open my back seam allowance, and I'll use the rest of that seam as an indication to help me press open the center back here. I am going to stitch this as a lapped or overlapped zipper, as usual. I do have a video about how I set in zippers here on the channel. I can link you over to that, because it's, of course, much easier to see what I'm doing in a plain muslin fabric than something as busy as this. And today I did actually hand prick the lapped side of my zipper. So this first side I will stitch by machine, but because this fabric wanted to stretch on me, I decided to go ahead and hand stitch the other side of the zipper. Once again, I really should have slipped some interfacing in here, but for some reason I was just like having an anti-fusible day in the sewing room. But again, it created more problems than it solved. So always, you know, pros and cons. I should have slipped some kind of interfacing in here. Even like the super lightweight knit interfacing would be good in something like this. Not that I keep that in stock. So I need to up my interfacing game, let's face it. Even like a strip of silk organza slipped into the fold back here would have just given this a tiny bit of extra stability and less stretch. Something to think about for the future, you know? I can always improve what I'm up to, that's for sure. But after I had hand stitched in the other side of the zipper here and the zipper was in, I could go ahead and hand stitch in this little waist yoke lining piece. So this covers up all those nasty raw edges that are left inside the dress and gives me a nice smooth finish in here. Also gives a little bit of extra stability to this waistline area, especially because I didn't interface along the zipper along the back. This is just sitting in that 2 layers of crepe. Of course, right here at the waist is where this is going to ever receive the most attention from me, like going out for gelato. Not that I've found a good gelato place up here yet. There's so many Italians. Where's the gelato? I digress, but this piece will add a little bit of extra stability and strength right here at the waist portion. And you could slip stitch this down for a truly invisible finish along the seam allowance of the original waist yoke. I am just going to fell it because, again, who is looking that closely at my waist yoke? The felling stitches practically disappear, and I just find it faster than slip stitching. And speaking of finishing things by hand, I am going to go ahead and turn my hem twice. First up about 1/4 inch, and then again about 3/8 inch, just under 1/2 inch. My apologies, as usual, for being raised in the United States. Though of course the metric versus imperial problem is one of the least derisive things this sort of origin story can lead to. Here is my finished, rather classic, late 1930s, early 1940s, 1939, the cusp, a decade cusp sort of a dress, finished up in this lightweight floral rayon crepe. And I did kind of make this dress to be the dark mode of a dress I made several years ago, and the video for that dress is actually over on Patreon, though that video was before I was using my top-down setup, and honestly I've just gotten much better at both pattern drafting and explaining pattern drafting since then, so perhaps stick with this one even if you do have access to that older Patreon video, because while I'm really pleased with how that other dress came out, revisiting the video was interesting. I do hope to continually improve my skills, but also my ability to teach throughout the years. In any case, I hope you enjoyed seeing how this project came together today, and thank you as always for watching, and a huge additional thank you to my patrons who of course make all of my videos and all of my work possible. And as always, I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, crafting, and decorating real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye! I have a tiny cut on my finger from trying to wash a chef knife, not to be graphic, but I am very clumsy. I have a tiny, like a paper cut basically, but like on the worst part of my thumb, and I just jammed my other thumb into it. Just not advised. The kind of thing I have to deal with quite a lot because I am not elegant in reality.